Now, a couple days away from the beginning of Mental Health Awareness Month on a subject that is near and dear to my heart. I've been open about my own struggles with mental health in the past. Had been until late 2018, treated for 7 years for clinical anxiety and clinical depression, and really found value in the therapy I went through as well as the medications that I had taken. And so many crisis situations that we see and experience day in and day out, oftentimes they have some kind of tie-in with mental health. If not, usually they have that kind of tie-in, which is why I'm very pleased this morning to have two excellent guests to talk about this and relate it to crises as well. First, I'm very pleased to welcome back to the program our good friend of the show, good friend of mine, Roshini Kumar, who is a C-suite strategist, licensed attorney, and host of the Crisis Files. She has a weekly podcast that drops on your favorite podcast platform entitled The Crisis Files. And she has the Crisis Files TV pilot that's currently being pitched to television and streaming outlets, which is very exciting. Roshini is a regular contributor on the syndicated Crime Door TV and an analyst for national outlets, including Court TV and NBC News Now. And you've heard her right here on the Jimmy Sengenberger Show she wrote down the past 8 years. But Roshini, good morning and welcome. It was August of 2014 that we had you on, so it's almost 9 years that you have been on the
Jimmy,
program.
That's amazing. That is amazing, and it's always an honor to come on your show.
It's always just a treat to have you, and I also want to congratulate you on episode number 40 coming up this week for the Crisis Files podcast. So we've been talking with you for years, but since you started the Crisis Files back in September.
Thank you. You were one of the first to interview me last August, or about September, a couple weeks after the first cases were starting to drop, case files. So thank you for being part of the journey of the Crisis Files also.
And I want to actually invite you to help me introduce our other guest, Dr. Cheryl Ziegler, here on the program, because she's somebody who you have spoken very highly of. She's on the podcast, The Crisis Files, as a regular contributor, offering perspectives as a licensed clinical psychologist and a play therapist in private practice, somebody who's on 9 News locally as a parent expert for the franchise series Mental Health and Me. And I think you can't have a mental health discussion, especially when we're tying in different angles, without talking to somebody who really understands this. Please help us welcome Dr. Cheryl Ziegler as well, Roshini.
Yeah, well, Dr. Z, as we call her on the Crisis Files, is just, first of all, very approachable, personable. And when I found out about her, I just said, Dr. Ziegler, please come on the Crisis Files and be part of the Crisis Squad. So about a year ago, she was part of the team. We shot our pilot. She came to Minneapolis to shoot that with us, and has been part of the podcast ever since. And now hopefully will be coming to a screen near you when the pilot is purchased. But there is no crisis that really can avoid a mental health or some wellness aspect. And Dr. Ziegler is our point person on those areas of crises.
Dr. Z, welcome to the program and good morning.
Oh, thanks for having me. Thank you to both of you for the kind introduction.
It's great to have you on the program, especially because this is such an important issue. I want to ask you, Dr. Ziegler, first. You know, when we hear discussions about mental health, and Roshini's right, you have all these crisis situations that have some form of a mental health component, but we hear a lot of talk, rightly so, about how there still exists in the public a stigma regarding mental health issues. I think we're kind of starting to finally break through, at least that's my sense, a little bit, toward eradicating that stigma. I mean, a long ways to go, but at least making some headway. Why do you think there is a stigma that exists? And do you agree that we're finally starting to maybe open up the doors a little bit more to discussions and to people recognizing this is something you're not just alone with and we need to talk about it as a society?
Absolutely. So I'll start by saying that stigma around mental health has existed for centuries. And so when you have something that's so deep-seated in terms of, let's say, families, and we don't talk about that, we don't talk about what, happened to grandpa or what happened to great-grandma, that's what I find in my private practice. There's generations of mental health issues that just nobody wanted to talk about. And then that permeates out to society. And so there's a lot of good reason why society had stigma around mental health issues. People used to be institutionalized easier. People were thought to be not contributors of society, again, hundreds of years ago, but sometimes just decades ago in some cases. So I understand why that stigma exists, but one of my purposes in life is to really reduce and eliminate mental health stigma. And simply put, when people say, how do you do that? You say, the research shows just by talking about it. You have to talk about it. And when we have situations, regardless of whatever people's politics are, but you have situations like John Fetterman and him being elected and then pretty soon after going in and checking himself in for treatment for clinical depression, those are the kinds of things that make big impacts. When there are celebrities or people who are in the limelight that are notarized by people, all of a sudden it goes, oh, yeah, maybe I need to look into my treatment. Even you speaking to your listeners and being really open about your experience really does make a difference. So we need to do more of that, and I agree with you. I think we are on our way, but we still have a long way to go.
Yeah, I think that's very well said. And Roshini Rajkumar, when you say, especially as a crisis strategist and coach, when you say that pretty much every crisis has some manifestation of a mental health issue or some mental health component to that, how do you realize that? How have you grown over these years to recognize that as a piece of this? Because I think it ties right in with this notion of stigma, that if you can recognize that, okay, you've got these crisis situations and there's some tie-in with mental health, then that could help to beat back some of the stigma a little bit, but also gives us a better understanding of how to address crisis situations, doesn't it?
It really does. And Jimmy, first of all, just the nature of the word crisis, it is not copacetic. It is not your warm, sunny Sunday morning. Something is wrong when we are in crisis or a crisis situation happens. And actually a recent Accenture study that was looking at trends for 2023. So the number one trend is we are now in a state of perma-crisis. Not just the United States, but the world. We are in a state of perma-crisis. So every day that you wake up, there could be, sadly, a mass shooting. There could be someone who has taken their life. There could be so many things, a health issue. So the nature of crisis is something has shocked the system in some way, whether it's your emotions, your mental well-being, your physical well-being, your community well-being. And so, first of all, recognizing that that is natural, that is normal. You're not outside of some sort of, freak situation. You're not a freak. You are in a normal situation. So first recognize it, and then be willing to, should you need it, ask for help. But as Dr. Z talks about, talking about it is very key. Talking about it with, the other key players that may be going through it with you, all of those things are so important to getting at the issue. And I really applaud you, Jimmy. I know over the years you have shared your journey, but just the mere sharing of this for someone like you who's a high-profile person, who writes, who speaks, who has his own show, it shows us all that mental health challenges can happen to anybody. It can be your neighbor, your son, your grandfather, your aunt. And that's what's important, is that normalizing. So maybe we ask more questions once it's out in the open.
Again, we are talking with communication and crisis coach Roshini Rajkumar, host of the Crisis Files podcast, and Dr. Cheryl Ziegler, Ph.D., a licensed clinical psychologist. And when you talk, Roshini, I want to go back to this notion of permacrisis, because you turn on the news and you are every day seeing a new crisis in news, whether it's local or it's national or it's global. we do have this constant barrage of things. How do you manage that, especially when you are, say, a leader who has to show some kind of strength and fortitude, and you might be looking out there saying, I'm dealing with this, but we've also got all of these crazy things that are going on, and you could be getting stressed out. You could have so many different things. But how do we, and this very broad question, of course, because you could talk about society, you could talk about government, business, what have you, but how do we address and handle this idea that we are facing a perma-crisis?
Well, it really does start with the individual. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Dr. Z.
No, go ahead. Go ahead. No, go ahead.
Yeah.
Well, I want Dr. Z to jump in, but I'll quickly say we actually did a case file called Burnout, and we talked with the editor-in-chief of Experience Life magazine, which is a lifetime publication, and she shared her tips for staying away yourself from too much of that bad news. You know, don't be constantly on your devices. Have some built-in rules for yourself so that you can protect yourself and your well-being. So it really does start with you, and I'm sure Dr. Z has far more to say about this even than I on that topic.
Yeah, go ahead, Dr. Z.
Well, sorry for jumping in there. I agree with that. The problem is that we have, a life that lives beyond, the television in your living room, and that really is one place to start, which is really monitoring both the source of your news and then the quality and quantity of how much you choose to take in. So you have to do things like, okay, I will, set boundaries for myself. I'll wake up in the morning. Okay, yes, I do want to know the news or not. Some people say it's much better for my mental health not to wake up first thing in the morning and consume news. But because news is available to us 24/7, and again, we weren't really raised that way. It was you went home and sort of watched the evening news. Oh, what happened today? And so we're so far from that now that it is important to set those boundaries and to really restrict the limits and even the source. But it's also really important to make your life as small and community oriented as possible. When the world now is in crisis, when the world itself is experiencing collective trauma and collective violence, it's important to kind of say, let me start with the smallest communities that I belong to. So my house, how is my family? How are my loved ones? Okay, now maybe my kid's school. How's the school? So if you can start small, you narrow things in, you have a greater sense of control, and that's part of what anxiety is about. That's what part of fear is about. It's that lack of control. Oh my gosh, there's so much going on.
Yeah.
There are mass shootings going on. What can I possibly do? So really thinking smaller in those kind of cases gives you a better sense of control and power. It can be really helpful.
Well, and then, Dr. Cheryl Ziegler, you have the situation across the country where one of the great crises that we're facing with mental health is among youth. There are so many young people, especially because of COVID isolation and being forced out of schools and so forth, who are dealing with some of the most dramatic mental health issues of anxiety, depression, and all sorts of other struggles that are hugely significant. Like oftentimes we throw around the word crisis. This really is a crisis of youth mental health. And then you add in the component, too, of parents trying to figure out how can I help my kids when, I'm dealing with my own struggles. Maybe you got issues going on at work and what have you, especially this was significant during the pandemic. But what have you been noticing about the youth mental health crisis that has really brought a focus, especially because we've seen so many youth suicides of late, Dr. Ziegler?
Yeah, and unfortunately here in Colorado, we can almost lead that way in terms of youth suicide. There's so much to say here, but what happened was we had a very weak and fragile mental health system prior to the pandemic, and then once the pandemic started, that's really when it actually broke. And so if people can actually visualize, the breaking of a dam kind of thing, that's what happened. By May of 2020, we officially were in a state of mental health emergency which is not something that's ever been categorized. That's not a term that's ever been used before, but that's how significant it was. And how that started is, there were just parents taking their kids to the emergency room and saying, my kid is suicidal, my kid is, very depressed, they say they're hopeless. And so we had ERs that were working as, mental health sort of psychiatric wards, and that's not what they're meant for, and an overflow with lack of beds, with lack of treatment providers. We still have that now. We have incredible wait lists. We have a huge shortage of both psychologists and psychiatrists. And so we really are in a state where kids have not rebounded. This is something that really permeates into the educational system. So now we have, recently this week, DPS was talking about, we opened up money and resources for school psychologists, mental health in schools. We don't have enough applicants. There's not enough people to fill these positions. And so it permeates into the educational system. It permeates into the family system, the healthcare systems. And so we now have a generation of kids who are on social media, who are sharing their struggles with all sorts of mental health issues, and then we don't have the available help. And so the crisis is now in multiple areas, from the actual kids to the lack of help, and then to the effects on the educational systems. And so we really have a long way to go. If you look at the Surgeon General's reports, among the 5 top issues, he sees the youth mental health crisis as a public state of emergency as well. It's a public health issue. And so we have a lot of work to do in this area.
I think that's so true and very well said, Dr. Z. Roshini Rajkumar, what observations have you noticed in that regard? And do you think that from a leadership standpoint, you talk a lot about leadership and how leaders handle crisis situations and emergencies like this, do you think our leaders are addressing the youth mental health emergency in the way that they should be?
I absolutely do not. And I've been on your show many times critical of state and federal leaders because there is a lot of rancor within parties, between the parties, and sometimes that overtakes. Those political issues overtake the actual human issues and problem solving. And we at the Crisis Files are really trying to not just point out the problems, but give you some solutions, maybe some prevention. One of the things I would say as someone who, as far as I know, Jimmy and Dr. Z, I do not suffer a mental health issue, but I have some people close to me who do. And some of the things that I've learned is the key for many of them, is the ability to have transition time. So I think about this as Dr. Z so eloquently talks about our children. For a parent who is at wit's end, what about trying not to schedule so much and give that child more transition time between school, then into their homework, then into a meal, or maybe they don't need as many extracurricular activities. And I've found with the people in my life who have identified that for me, when I can show grace and patience and just give them the transition time they need to do whatever and not expect the back to back to back to back, which maybe I'm able to do on some days because that's just how my brain works, right? So that in itself has been really eye-opening for me. Yeah. And even as I go out into society and I don't know what everyone walks around with, just having this sense of people's brains work differently. Some people are introverts, some are extroverts, some need more transition time, some are in different places on the neurodiversity spectrum. And just knowing that I want to show some kind of grace, I hope that right. Makes me just a more healthy human being walking around, and maybe I help others just by being a little more aware.
Our guests are Roshini Rajkumar, host of the Crisis Files podcast. Listen to it today on your favorite podcast platform, and one of the featured regular contributors to the Crisis Files, Dr. Cheryl Ziegler, licensed clinical psychologist who lives right here in the Denver metro area in Colorado. We are overdue for a break. We'll have a little bit more time on the other side with our guests coming up. You're listening to the Jimmy Sengenberger Show here on Denver's local talk leader, News Talk 710 KNUS. The great late Bobby Blue Bland bringing us back on the Jimmy Sengenberger Show. The blues, a great way to channel those blues you're feeling, those mental health struggles that you've got, and that's why we bring them here to the Jimmy Sengenberger Show. News Talk 710 KNUS. We are getting lower on time here. Time flies when you're having a great conversation with two brilliant ladies who are tremendous communicators as well. Roshini Rajkumar, host of the Crisis Files podcast, joining us, and great friend of the program, longtime guest on the show, as well as Dr. Cheryl Ziegler, who is right in the Denver area and is a licensed clinical psychologist, host of her own podcast, Dr. Cheryl's Pod Couch. Roshini, I would be remiss if I didn't ask you, and this will tie in briefly. We got about 5 minutes left with the two of you. We've seen in the past week, just in fact, in like one day, we had all this news where you had the CEO of NBC Universal, Jeff Shell, was fired over alleged improprieties and so forth. Then you had Tucker Carlson fired from Fox News and Don Lemon fired from CNN, and it all happened. What do you make of this?
It was just, I mean, I can't even, that was one of those that just surprised even me, and I feel like I've seen it all. It really does show that, first of all, these outlets have a lot of fascination, by our country, but they also have a lot of influence. But it also shows that just as someone can garner that kind of following and influence, they can be knocked down, and it can be for various reasons. I mean, there were various crises that were connected to each of those men. And some we may never know. Some little details are coming out. They didn't always have to do with sex. Sometimes they dealt with something else. So it is very interesting that at this time, for so many decades, these networks lived with some of this stuff going on behind the scenes, behind closed doors. But now they're almost emboldened to say, we're going to take a stance, and it doesn't help our brand to let this continue to brew and stir within our walls. But it is quite fascinating and definitely could be a topic of a whole 3-hour show, Jimmy.
Without a doubt. And Dr. Ziegler, one thing that we see in today's day and age, we have a media diet where we're constantly consuming content, and oftentimes, especially in the political sphere, it's very negative. A friend said the other day in a text, and I think Roshini commented it off air, that we have so much angertainment that's out there. And it could do a number on your mental health, especially if you're consuming that content frequently. What does that bring to mind? And are there any thoughts that you have as a result of seeing these major media figures just suddenly go poof from the television airwaves?
Yeah, I mean, I have really two thoughts. One of them is that brand awareness and being on brand is more important, I think, today than ever. And companies have decided that they are going to align themselves with social issues, with justice issues. And so, these are the kinds of things I think that are going to happen more often than not, if that is what companies are going to continue to do. I think the other piece is that when people are watching these kinds of shows, what's happened is we've blurred the lines between I'm consuming the news versus I'm just consuming somebody's opinion. And I think those lines, it started slowly, but they're so blurred now that you have to be clear. You're watching an opinion show versus maybe you're just watching the news. And I think part of that, and potentially with Tucker Carlson particularly, when those lines got blurred and the story really opened up, the network probably felt like we've got to take a stance with this. And so that's one of the things that concerns me. I think it's fine if you want to hear somebody's opinion and you love to hear what they have to say, great, but really also have another space for how you know that you're consuming as much as possible just the news. And I think that's something that we're missing today. That would actually be very helpful to mental health.
Dr. Z, you said something that made me think, I could talk in depth with Roshini on this point of brand awareness and being on brand. It was such a savvy observation. Roshini, we've got about a minute and a half left. Feel free to chime in on that, but I do also want to ask, as we're getting low on time here, you've got your podcast, The Crisis Files, with a great set of contributors that constantly are offering various insights. And you've hit that 40 episode milestone, episode 41, already coming out in the next day or two. Tell us what's going on there.
Yeah, so Dr. Cheryl Ziegler is part of my 4-person crisis squad. We also have other subject matter experts who come on. This episode, number 40, is called Good Sex and Bad Sex. We have a clinical psychologist who's in the relationship area who helps us kind of understand the differences between men and women. And it is actually neurological and biological, not just one or the other. And then on Monday, case file number 41, I'll do it later. We talk to a productivity expert about procrastination, something that we all might happen, face in our lives. But what's exciting about the Crisis Files is we have some great people sharing expertise, really trying to provide solutions, prevent crisis in your life, which is definitely something Dr. Z and I are all about. And it has been a really amazing journey, and it's only really begun, Jimmy. So thanks for being part of it. And I hope to come back in the very near future to tell you where the TV version of it will land in some initial talks with some different places. And that's been a journey for me, this ex-TV reporter. It's a whole different world out there trying to sell a TV show. But meantime, the Crisis Squad podcast will continue, or the Crisis Files podcast will continue. Find it at thecrisisfiles.com. We'll also put this conversation that you're having with me and Dr. Z on thecrisisfiles.com, and then wherever people get podcasts. So we hope that we can lend our voices to solutions.
Well, and I will say I've been cooking up an idea because you talked about maybe me coming on the podcast on the Crisis Files, and I've been thinking with some things going on here locally, I might have something, an idea for you. Roshini Rajkumar, host of the Crisis Files podcast, and Dr. Cheryl Ziegler, thank you both so very much for joining us this morning. Really appreciate your time. Important discussions.
Thank you,
Thanks
Jimmy.
for having us.
Thank you, and we will have you back soon.